In this video, I'll be going over how to use the UV editor. I will be putting the UV editor in full screen just in a second, but in order to get to the UV editor, you need to go to UV editor. It'll be right at the top. Now, in order to see the UVs for the object you have selected, you need to make sure you have that object that you want to work on selected first. So, for instance, I'm going to use the one that I've already UV unwrapped, and then now we can start work on it. You'll see that if I try to click on it, nothing happens. The reason being is that we can't really move or edit these shells unless we use what is known as the move tool or the latence tool. We'll go to the move tool first. It's basically like your object mode in the perspective view. So when I'm in the move tool, all I can do is select any of these shells that I want, and just like in Maya, press W, you can move up and down, left and right. And the hotkeys for scale and rotate are also the same as well. So if I press E, I can also rotate. If I press R, I can also scale. And you can see that I can scale in the different axes, which is only Y and X. We only have two axes here because, again, this is just a flat 2D image. It's not going to have Z, which is the third dimension. And the one next to it is the UV latence tool, which is essentially the selection option when you're in a perspective view. So for instance, if I hold on the right mouse button over here, I can go to the edge, vertex, face, or object mode. So if I go to face, I can select faces there. Vice versa with vertex, I can select the vertices in that scene. Same sort of thing here, except we can't really go to, say, edge, for instance. We need to make sure we go on the latence tool first, and that way we can go to, say, edge. We can actually go to the entire shell itself, which is this, so we can just select the individual shells and move them around if we want. UV, which is basically sort of UV points. And you see that sort of like these brown dots on the screen there. Faces and vertices. Okay, so before we go on to actually going into more detail with this, we'll go through some of the other things that you will need to kind of know. So automatically, let me go back to object mode. When you select on your object that you may have already planar mapped or fully UV unwrapped, at default you'll just have the white lines. Now this is okay. Again, we can still use these tools with the white lines. You'll see that it goes blue so we know that we're actually in either the move or latence tool options. But the best thing that you should do is turn on this little blue box here, which is the toggle shaded UV display. And it basically adds a colored overlay to all the shells. It makes it a lot easier to kind of select stuff. Again, the white lines can kind of get lost, especially if you've got something in the background, like say like a checkered texture. It makes it very hard to see. With the shaded option on, it makes it a lot easier to kind of use. And the good thing about the shaded display is the fact that we can see if anything's overlaying. So for instance, you can see right now it's blue. So if I overlay this on top of that, let me just grab that again. So if I overlay this shell on top of the other shell, you can see that the color has gotten darker. That's a really good indication as to if you have multiple overlapping UV shells. So the darker the color is, basically means that the more UV shells that are overlaying with one another. Now, there's a few reasons as to why you don't want UV shells to overlap. One could be the fact that you don't want every single side of the object to have the exact same texture. So for instance, if I wanted this face here to have graffiti, maybe I don't want it on the other side. But if I have graffiti on there, it will show up on both sides. Other reasons can be is light maps. You want to have your UV shell separated because light maps in game engines basically calculate and bake how lighting is dispersed around your object. And if you have two overlaying UV shells, that can cause some issues. That's kind of more technical stuff. I'm not really going to get that much right now. So I'm just going to quickly move this back. You will find sometimes it is kind of hard. You might have noticed earlier on that when I'm trying to move stuff around, it kind of just snaps back into place like so. If you don't want it to do that, you can just press W to override it, and you can just move it freely as you so wish. I'm just going to quickly just move everything back like so. Okay, so one of the other tools that I want to use is a checkered texture. The reason being is because a checkered texture is basically a placeholder texture to kind of see and get an idea as to how your texture will stretch across your object and how much detail is going to be. Now you can have your own personal checker texture apply to this, again just by assigning new material, adding a checker texture that you got from online or one you made yourself. But the cool thing is with the UV editor is that it does have its own inbuilt one. So just at the bottom left of where the toggle shaded UV display is, we have the display checker tiles. Click that on, and you might have noticed that we have a checker texture all around our object. You can also see it in this display here. Now, me personally, I don't really like the checker texture. It's kind of bright and it's kind of hard to see, but I do still use it. But in the UV editor, I really hate the fact that it's on. So I like to turn it off. So if you turn off this little picture here, which is called display image on or off, it just allows it so that in the UV editor you'll always have just like a grey background. It just makes life a lot easier to kind of see stuff, because again, it just makes it a bit hard to kind of see things. That's my own personal preference. You don't have to do that if you want, but the option is there if you need it. Now, why we want a checker texture, again, like I said, is to kind of see how much detail that your object is going to have. Now, the best way I can describe these squares is, the smaller the squares or the more squares that are on screen, the more detail is going to be on that particular object, or that particular part of the object. Now, again, as I said in the previous video, when you're UV wrapping and placing your UV shells, you have to put it within this particular grid here. And you can kind of see you've got a finite amount of space that you have in that grid. So you need to make sure that you're giving out the right amount of space for specific shells. So you've got to look at your object and say which part of the object has the most surface area. If it's a lot more surface area compared to another part of the object, it requires the most amount of detail. So again, with this one here, that's the right one. So again, I've made it really large so that way it has the most detail, because again, once you put a texture on it, if this is going to be very small, so for instance, if I just scale this down, if I put a texture on it now, it's going to look blurry, it's going to look kind of stretched across, and it's just not going to look right. Again, you do need more surface area because this is taking up a huge amount of part of the scene. But one thing you need to kind of make sure is that if I, for example, stretch it in the x-axis, if I stretch it across too much, you can kind of see that the texture will just kind of squash a little bit too much, or in the opposite direction, it will stretch across in a different direction. So again, that's why you would want to have the checker texture on, because if I applied a brick texture to this wall right now, the bricks would just be like 10 foot long, or it'd be stretched across, and it would look sort of blurry, pixelated, and look very, very awful. And one reason why you'd want the checker texture on as well is this is going to be like a seamless wall texture that's going across the other side as well. I need to make sure that the squares on this side are the same shape as the one on the other side, and they also line up correctly as well. So if I just quickly do something here, I'll explain that process in a second. So for instance, I have this face here. So if I move it up and down, you see that right now the squares don't align properly. So I need to kind of move them into place to make sure they line up correctly. What you'll find as well is, if you zoom out, you'll notice that your movements are a lot more sporadic. But the more and more you zoom into the grid, you'll notice that you have a lot more control. So you might find you might need to zoom in like really close to make sure that it kind of lines up correctly. And also got to try to line it up correctly on the other side as well, which can be quite difficult. It'll take a bit of playing around. Again, what will happen now is if I had a brick here, it will nicely sort of overlap to the other side as well. So you need to kind of make sure that the right amount of squares are on screen at one time, and they also line up correctly as well. Another tool that you can use is sewing and cutting UVs. So you might have noticed that I had to kind of cut up those sides there. So what we need to do is, what we can do is that we can actually merge these separate UV shells into one UV shell if we so wish. So if you go to the Layers tool and go to Edge, and you select or drag and select one of the edges, you'll notice that it hasn't just selected one edge, but it's selected another one as well. And you can see that as I hover over it, it kind of highlights as well. Reason being is because the UV editor is telling you that these two edges can be merged together or sewed together. And you can do it with opposite sides as well, so this edge can go there if you wanted to, or we can put this edge to that edge there. So what we can do is click on it, hold down Shift and the right mouse button. And you see we have three different options. We have cut UVs, sew UVs, and move and sew UVs. We have a few options here, but these are kind of the three main ones that you want to do. Now, if you go to move sew UVs, what you'll see is that UV shell would have moved and merged together with this UV shell. So if I go back to the move option, you'll see that now this is one entire object. If we went to sew UVs, it wouldn't move. They would try to merge together from their respective translations. So a lot of times you might want to kind of move it manually and then sew it together. Like with any sort of tool, it can be used double-edged. So sometimes the move and sew UVs won't always create something that you like. So for instance, if I make this larger, select that edge, move sew UV, you'll see that it tries to kind of reshape itself to kind of fit that particular edge. So a lot of times you got to make sure that your UV shell is pretty much the exact same scale as the other edge. That way you don't get any sort of weird sort of distortions. So move sew UV, same there, move sew UV. Or I could manually move it there, have the two edges overlapping, and then go to sew UV if I so wish. But if I want to separate them, again, all I have to do is I have to select those edges, or select the one edge, sorry, because it's now one edge. Then go to cut UVs. Now you can't really tell, but it has actually cut those UVs. So if I select that UV shell now, you'll see that it's no longer one shell, but rather three. Now this can be quite a useful tool, because sometimes you might find UV shells that are far too long or far too large. So you might find it easy to kind of cut things in half maybe sometimes. I think, let's have a look. And you can see here there's a few different tools here as well. You have the grab tool, for instance, it lets you kind of grab certain parts of the UV shells. The cut tool, again, it's kind of the same thing as the cut UVs. It kind of automatically does it for you, so just sort of slicing up the UV editor there. Pin tool, smear, optimizing, unfold tool. So for instance, it kind of unfolds itself manually. But these are sort of things you might want to kind of play around with and experiment yourself. But these are kind of the main tools: the move tool, the lattice tool, sewing, the shader, and the toggle display. Now, what we can do as well, sometimes you may, let me just go back a few more times. There we are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this particular face up. So if I move it up, you might notice that there's some distortion on the squares now as well. You might be wondering why have the squares kind of skewed. Well, if you look at the UV shell here for this face, which is this shell here, you can see that shell doesn't really represent that particular model quite well. So you'd have to kind of go in and manually alter the UV shell. A lot of times when it comes to man-made objects, you'll be entirely fine. A lot of times when you use the planar mapping option or the cylindrical mapping option, it will create pretty much a very decent UV shell that you can use. But when you come into more complex stuff, so maybe stuff that's going to have these sort of weird sort of twists and turns in them, humanoid characters, or sort of natural stuff, maybe like say rocks, trees, foliage, that sort of stuff, you will find that you will have to kind of do the sort of nitty-gritty work, kind of manually move around UV points in order to get the squares to kind of look more natural, look more correct, in order to kind of get your texture nicely and smoothly around your object. So what we have to do is we go to, say, the UV lattice tool, hold on the right mouse button and go to UV. And I believe it will be these two UV points here. Yep, you can see that I've got them selected there. And all I would have to do is just move them up. So if you see here, if I move these, you can see that the squares are kind of going back into place, looking a lot more natural. So yeah, that's perfect. Now that's quite a simple object. More complicated stuff will take a lot more time. You want to kind of make sure that there's not too much skewing or too much distortion on the squares. Depending on how small the object is or how far away it's going to be from the player, you can get away with a little bit of distortion. But again, it's the whole idea is you don't want it to look too unnatural. You need to kind of fool the player into thinking that it is correct. So again, I can kind of go in and kind of mess around with these if I want to. This is kind of more like manual, sort of like manual aspects of UV unwrapping. You will find that if you're doing very complex objects, like this square is quite simple, you will be finding a lot of times you'll be messing around with the UV points, trying to get them all to be correct, or pretty much near as, if you can. And once you're happy with that, you'd go to polygons, UV snapshot. You want to make sure that you're in the power of 2, so 1024 by 1024, 2048 by 2048, 4086 I believe by 4086, and so on and so forth. Press browse. Now if you have it set to the project files, it'll automatically save into your image folders. You can save it anywhere else you want. Again, I do stress the fact of using appropriate file directories, so it should automatically go to the images. I want to make sure that it's a PNG. But I'm not going to explain why it needs to be a PNG right now. Reason being is because it has a transparent background. But if you watch my Photoshop tutorials, it kind of explains as to why you'll need a PNG file. And you press OK, and that will save it. And you'll see here at the bottom that it has saved that particular UV shell. So that's all for the UV editor. If you're watching this first, I would say go on to watching the cylindrical or planar mappings. If you already watched that and watching this now, I would suggest watching the demonstration that I'm going to do as well. So I'm going to take an object, probably another simple sort of UV editor, and quickly go through the process of UV unwrapping.